In a bustling art gallery filled with wealthy elites and prestigious collectors, Mark Williams, a ruthless business tycoon, stood alone, admiring a portrait of a beautiful young woman. The crowd buzzed around him, but he couldn't pull his eyes away. Something about her seemed hauntingly familiar. Just as he was about to turn away, a small voice cut through the room like a knife. "Hey, mister, that's my mommy." A little girl's innocent words shattered his composure. He spun around, staring at her wide, curious eyes, and in that single moment, his world stopped. Because the woman in the painting was Laura, the love he thought he had lost forever. But what stunned him even more was the little girl's next sentence. "My daddy never came back. Do you know him?" Mark felt his heart drop. Who was this child? And what did she mean by her daddy? Was this just a coincidence? Or was this little girl unknowingly holding the key to a past he thought was long buried? As he looked into her hopeful eyes, Mark realized this encounter would unravel secrets that could shatter everything he knew about his life, and possibly give him a second chance at the one thing he thought he'd lost forever: a family. Mark Williams stood amidst the splendor of the Grand Art Gallery, its vast halls filled with the soft hum of conversations and the occasional tinkling of glasses. The atmosphere was rich with sophistication. High-profile guests dressed in elegant evening wear moved gracefully, admiring the artwork adorning the walls. It was a charity event he had been obligated to attend, another networking opportunity in his endless string of commitments. He was used to blending in at such gatherings, his presence commanding attention, yet remaining detached. But tonight, something was different. He found himself drawn to one particular corner of the room. A painting, tucked slightly away from the main exhibition area, caught his eye. It wasn't the most prominent piece, certainly not the one and people were gathered around, but it had a magnetic pull that Mark couldn't ignore. He moved closer, his gaze riveted on the canvas. There, captured in strokes of vivid color and soft ethereal light, was the portrait of a woman he knew all too well. Mark's breath caught in his throat. Laura. The name echoed in his mind, sharp and clear, sending a shiver down his spine. He hadn't seen her in years, hadn't even allowed himself to think of her. But here she was, looking back at him from the painting with those same expressive eyes, that same smile that had once lit up his world. The brushstrokes captured every nuance of her beauty, every detail that made her unforgettable. Time seemed to blur as he stared, lost in memories he had long buried. He took a step closer, his eyes scanning the delicate lines of her face, the warmth in her gaze. There was something hauntingly familiar about it, yet different. This wasn't the Laura he remembered. There was a subtle sadness in her expression, a wisdom that seemed to transcend the vibrant colors. He felt a pang in his chest, a strange, twisting mix of longing and regret. "How?" he murmured softly to himself, reaching out as if to touch the canvas, but stopping just short. How had this painting ended up here? And more importantly, why did it feel like she was speaking to him through it, like she had left a message he couldn't quite decipher? A soft tug at his sleeve pulled him out of his thoughts. He blinked, glancing down in surprise. A little girl stood beside him, her large, curious eyes fixed on his face. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, her curly brown hair tied up in messy pigtails, a tiny blue dress swishing around her legs. "Hey, mister," she said, her voice light and sweet. "Why are you staring at my mommy?" Mark felt his heart skip a beat. He looked at the girl, then back at the painting, and then at her again, his mind struggling to process what she had just said. "Your mommy?" he echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. The little girl nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Yep, that's my mommy. She painted lots of pictures, but this one's my favorite." Mark's gaze flickered between the girl and the portrait, his mind reeling. Could it be true? Could this little girl be hers? He swallowed hard, his pulse racing. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Sophie," she replied proudly, tilting her head up to meet his gaze. "What's yours?" "Mark," he murmured, still in shock. He crouched down slowly, bringing himself to her eye level. "Sophie, how old are you?" 6.5, she said, holding up 7 fingers. 6. The number rang in his ears like a bell. 6 years. 6 years since he had last seen Laura. 6 years since he had walked away, choosing his career over the woman he loved. His heart tightened painfully. Could it be? Could Sophie really be? Who? Who is your daddy? The question slipped out before he could stop it, his voice hoarse. Sophie's smile faded slightly. She shrugged, looking down at her shoes. Mommy said my daddy was a very busy man, that he had to go far away for work, but she said he loved me very much. Mark felt like he had been punched in the gut. His eyes burned as he stared at her, his mind spinning. He had loved Laura, more than he had ever loved anyone. But he had left, convinced that his career and ambitions were more important. He hadn't known she was pregnant. He hadn't known. I'm sorry, but who are you? A new voice cut through the fog of his thoughts, sharp and wary. Mark glanced up to see a woman approaching, middle-aged with a kind face and a stern expression. She looked between Mark and Sophie, her eyes narrowing slightly. Mark cleared his throat, standing up quickly. I was just admiring the painting. The woman's gaze softened as she looked at Sophie. Sweetheart, come here. Sophie hesitated, then skipped over to the woman's side, her hand slipping into hers. He was looking at Mommy's picture, Martha, she said, her voice innocent and bright. Martha. The name struck a chord. He remembered Laura mentioning a friend named Martha, someone who had been there for her through thick and thin. His heart ached as he looked at her, 1,000 questions burning in his eyes. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I knew Laura a long time ago. Martha's eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across her face. You knew Laura? Yes, Mark whispered, his voice tight. We were close before I left. Understanding dawned in Martha's eyes, followed quickly by something else. Something wary, almost protective. She tightened her grip on Sophie's hand, her gaze searching his face. She never told me, Mark murmured, his gaze locked on Sophie's small, delicate features. She never told me about her. Martha's expression softened, but her shoulders remained tense. Laura didn't want to disrupt your life, she said quietly. She didn't want to hold you back. Mark felt his heart twist painfully. Hold me back? From what? He demanded, his voice rough. From knowing my own daughter? Martha flinched slightly, glancing at Sophie, who was watching them with wide, curious eyes. It's complicated, she whispered. Laura made her choices, and she chose to protect Sophie. Protect her from what? Mark's voice cracked. He was vaguely aware that they were drawing a few curious glances, but he didn't care. Nothing mattered except the little girl standing just a few feet away, the child he had never known existed. From you, Martha said softly, her voice gentle but firm. From a life of chaos and uncertainty. From a father who might not have been ready to be a father. Mark stared at her, his chest heaving. The words cut deep, each one like a blade twisting in his heart. She was right. Back then, he had been consumed by his ambition, blinded by his drive to succeed. Would he have made the same choices if he had known about Sophie? Would he have been the father she needed? I need to know her, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Please, just let me talk to her. Let me… Mark, Martha said gently, stepping closer. This isn't just about you. This is about Sophie. You can't just barge into her life and expect her to understand. She's been through a lot. Mark felt his throat tighten as he looked down at Sophie, who was staring up at him with wide, trusting eyes. I know, he whispered, but I want to try. Please, Martha, just give me a chance. Martha studied him for a long moment, her gaze piercing. Then slowly she nodded. All right, she said softly, but you take it slow. And if I think, for even a second, that you're going to hurt her, I won't, Mark interrupted, his voice fierce. I would never hurt her. I swear, Martha sighed, glancing down at Sophie. Sweetheart, why don't you go play for a bit? I need to talk to Mr. Williams. Sophie looked up at Mark, her gaze hesitant. Will you still be here when I come back? Mark's heart shattered. He knelt down, his gaze locked on hers. Yes, Sophie, he whispered. I'll be here. Sophie studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. Okay. She skipped off toward the play area, her curls bouncing with each step. Mark straightened slowly, his eyes never leaving Sophie's small, retreating figure. Thank you, he murmured, his voice thick. For everything. Martha sighed softly. Don't thank me yet. She's going to have questions, and you need to be ready to answer them. Mark nodded, his jaw tight. He was ready. He would face whatever questions Sophie had, whatever fears or doubts Martha harbored. Because he was done running, he had found his daughter, and he wasn't going to lose her again. Mark's life felt surreal in the days that followed. Everything else seemed to fade into the background. His meetings, his business deals, even the ringing of his phone. All he could think about was the fact that he had a daughter, a beautiful, vibrant little girl named Sophie. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. He wanted to know everything about her, to fill in the years he had missed, but he also knew he had to tread carefully. She didn't know him. He was still a stranger to her, no matter how desperately he wanted to change that. He spent every free moment talking to Martha, who had reluctantly agreed to answer his questions. Each conversation peeled back another layer of the life Laura had built without him, revealing pieces of a story that filled Mark with both sorrow and admiration. She was brave, you know, Martha said one evening over coffee in her small, cozy kitchen. Braver than anyone gave her credit for. Mark leaned forward, his gaze intent on her face. Tell me more, please. Martha sighed, stirring her tea slowly. After you left, Laura was heartbroken. But she didn't let it show. She threw herself into her art, started taking on commissions, even taught a few classes. She built a small but loyal following. People loved her work. And when she found out she was pregnant, Martha paused, her eyes softening. She was scared, but she was determined. She decided to keep Sophie, no matter what. Mark's heart tightened. He could picture it so vividly, Laura standing in front of her easel, stubborn and fierce, her belly growing rounder with each passing month. He should have been there. He should have been the one holding her hand, reassuring her that they could do this together. But instead, she had done it alone. I can't believe she didn't tell me, he murmured, his voice rough. Why would she keep it from me? Martha's gaze was steady. Because she knew what kind of man you were back then. Ambitious, restless. She was afraid that telling you would either derail your dreams or make you feel trapped. And she didn't want that. Mark flinched, her words hitting home. He had been ambitious, so ambitious that he'd let the best thing in his life slip through his fingers. But I would have come back, he whispered, more to himself than to Martha. If I'd known, I would have come back. Maybe, Martha said softly. But would you have stayed? Laura didn't want you to come out of obligation. She wanted you to want it, to want her. Mark clenched his fists, staring down at his hands. He had loved Laura more than anything, but he had also been terrified of commitment. He had convinced himself that there would always be time for them, that once he made his mark in the business world, they could pick up where they left off. He had been wrong. So she raised Sophie on her own, he murmured, his chest aching. Martha nodded. She did, and she did a damn good job, too. Sophie is bright and kind, just like her mother. But she's been through a lot, Mark. Losing Laura, it broke her, and I've tried my best, but I'm not her mother. Mark felt his throat tighten. What happened? How did Laura? She got sick, Martha said quietly, her gaze dropping to her cup. It started off as something small. She thought it was just a flu, but it didn't go away. By the time she saw a doctor, it was already too late. Ovarian cancer. It spread fast. Mark sucked in a breath, pain slicing through him like a knife. I should have been there, he choked out. I should have. Stop. Martha's voice was firm but not unkind. This isn't about what you should have done. This is about what you're going to do now. Mark stared at her, his vision blurred with unshed tears. What was he going to do? How could he ever make up for the years he had lost, for the pain Laura must have felt facing it all alone? I want to be a father to Sophie, he whispered, his voice trembling. I want to be there for her. Please, Martha, let me try. Martha studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Then she nodded slowly. Okay, she said softly. But it won't be easy, Mark. Sophie is fragile. You'll have to take it one step at a time. Mark swallowed hard, nodding. I will, I promise. It took weeks, agonizing, painstaking weeks, before Martha agreed to let him spend more time with Sophie. He visited the park every day, arriving early and waiting patiently until Sophie showed up. At first she was shy, sticking close to Martha's side, casting him curious but cautious glances. But little by little she began to warm up to him. They started with small things, playing on the swings, building sandcastles together, sharing stories about their day. Mark never pushed, never pried. He wanted Sophie to come to him, to trust him, and eventually she did. One sunny afternoon, as they sat side by side on a park bench, Sophie looked up at him with wide, solemn eyes. Did you know my mommy? She asked softly. Mark's heart lurched. He nodded, forcing himself to smile. Yes, sweetheart, I knew her. I loved her very much. Sophie frowned thoughtfully, her small fingers twisting in her lap. Then, why weren't you with us? The question stabbed deep, the guilt washing over him in a tidal wave. How did he explain it? How did he make her understand that he had made the worst mistake of his life by leaving? He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. I didn't know about you, he whispered, his voice hoarse. I didn't know I had a little girl. If I had, I would have been there. I would have done everything I could to be with you and your mommy. Sophie studied him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face. But you're here now. Yes, Mark said firmly, his heart aching. I'm here now, and I'm never going to leave you, Sophie. I promise. For a moment she just stared at him, her small face serious. Then slowly, she nodded. Okay. It was a tiny word, but it was everything. Mark felt a surge of hope, his chest tightening with emotion. She believed him. She was giving him a chance. The next few weeks were filled with small victories, Sophie holding his hand without hesitation, laughing at his silly jokes, asking him to read her a bedtime story when Martha let him tuck her in one evening. Each little moment felt monumental, a step closer to building the bond he so desperately craved. But there were still shadows. Late at night, when Sophie thought no one was watching, Mark would catch her staring at a photo of Laura, her small face sad and lost. And each time his heart broke a little more. Daddy? Sophie's small voice pulled him from his thoughts one evening as they sat together on the couch watching a movie. She had started calling him Daddy tentatively, as if testing the word, and each time she said it, it filled him with a fierce, overwhelming joy. Yes, sweetheart. Do you think Mommy misses me? The question caught him off guard. Mark blinked, his chest tightening. I think she does, he said softly, reaching out to tuck a stray curl behind her ear. But she's always with you, you know? Even if you can't see her. Sophie's brow furrowed. But I miss her. A lot. Mark swallowed hard, his heart aching. He pulled her close, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. I know, sweetheart. I miss her too. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, snuggling closer to him. Do you think she'd be happy that you're here now? Mark closed his eyes, his throat tightening with emotion. Yes, he whispered, his voice thick. I think she'd be very happy. Sophie nodded, her small hand slipping into his. Me too. That night, after he had tucked Sophie into bed and watched her drift off to sleep, Mark stood in the doorway of her room, his chest tight. He had come so far, but there was still so much left to do. He needed to prove to Sophie that he was in this for the long haul, that he wasn't going to leave no matter what, and he needed to honor Laura's memory, to make sure that Sophie knew just how much her mother had loved her. He had failed Laura once. He wasn't going to fail her daughter. He pulled out his phone, his gaze drifting to the painting he had first seen in the gallery. The painting that had started it all. An idea began to form, a way to show Sophie that her mother's legacy would live on, that she was loved and cherished, even in death. Martha, he murmured when she answered the phone. I want to do something for Sophie, and for Laura, something big. Martha was silent for a long moment, then she sighed softly. What are you planning, Mark? Mark's grip tightened on the phone, his gaze fierce. I want to set up an exhibition, he said quietly. A special one. Just for Laura. I want Sophie to see how amazing her mother was. The silence on the other end of the line stretched out. Then Martha exhaled softly. All right, she said finally. But don't do this for yourself. Do it for Sophie. I will, Mark promised, his voice steady. I'm doing this for her, for both of them. And he would. He would make sure that the world remembered Laura Evans, not just as a brilliant artist, but as a loving mother who had given him the greatest gift of all. Mark stood in front of the art studio that had once been Laura's sanctuary, his heart pounding. It had been weeks since he'd set the plan in motion to create a special exhibition for her, and the gallery was finally coming together. He had spared no expense, reaching out to every collector and friend who had one of Laura's works, gathering pieces that showcased her talent and passion. But the most important person, the one whose approval mattered more than anyone else's, had yet to see it. Sophie. She stood beside him now, her small hand tucked into his. She looked up at him, her blue eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. Daddy, what are we doing here? Mark crouched down so he was at her eye level, his heart swelling at the sight of her. I have a surprise for you, sweetheart. Something very special. Sophie's eyes lit up with excitement, but then her gaze flickered with doubt. A surprise? What kind? Mark smiled softly, his voice gentle. It's something to show you how much your mommy loved you, and how proud she would be of you. Sophie hesitated, her small brow furrowing. But I don't understand. Mommy's not here. Mark's heart clenched. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. No, she's not here, but she's still with us in a lot of ways. And I wanted to show you one of the most beautiful ways she left her mark on the world. He held out his hand. Sophie looked at it for a moment, then slowly placed her tiny hand in his. Mark's chest tightened as he led her inside, pushing open the door to the small private gallery he had set up just for this moment. The room was softly lit, warm and inviting, with Laura's paintings carefully arranged along the walls. Each piece told a story, stories of love, joy, heartbreak, and hope. It was a tribute to the life Laura had lived, the struggles she had faced, and the legacy she had left behind. Sophie gasped softly, her eyes going wide as she looked around. Daddy, what is this? Mark swallowed hard, his throat tight. This, sweetheart, this is your mommy's work. Every painting here is hers. I wanted you to see how amazing she was, how much she poured her heart into these pieces. Sophie blinked up at him, her face pale. But why? Why did you do this? Because, Mark said softly, kneeling down beside her, I want you to know that your mommy's love is everywhere. It's in these paintings, in every color, every brushstroke, and it's in you too. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, her small shoulders trembling. But I miss her, she whispered, her voice breaking. Mark's heart shattered. He reached out, gently turning her to face him. I know, baby, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. I miss her too. But she would want you to be happy. She would want you to know that she loved you more than anything in the world. Sophie sniffled, her gaze darting to the nearest painting, a soft, dreamy piece filled with swirling colors and light. Mommy painted this? Yes, Mark said softly. She painted it for you. Sophie's gaze lingered on the painting, her expression filled with wonder. Then slowly she took a step forward, her fingers reaching out to touch the edge of the canvas. It's beautiful, she whispered. Mark felt his throat tighten. Just like you. Sophie turned to look at him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. But why didn't you come sooner? She asked softly. If you knew Mommy, why didn't you come to see me? The question tore through him, sharp and painful. Mark closed his eyes, fighting back the guilt that threatened to choke him. Because I didn't know, sweetheart, he whispered, his voice raw. I didn't know about you. If I had, I would have come. I would have been there. Sophie looked down, her small shoulders slumping. But you didn't. Mark's heart ached. He reached out, gently cupping her cheek. I know, and I'm so sorry, Sophie. I wish I could go back and change things, but I can't. All I can do is be here now, to be the daddy you deserve. Sophie stared at him, her gaze searching his face. Then slowly, she reached up, placing her tiny hand over his. "You're not going to leave?" Mark shook his head fiercely, his eyes burning. "No, sweetheart. I'm never going to leave. I'm here to stay. Forever." For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the weight of the unspoken words hanging between them. Then finally, Sophie nodded, a tiny, tentative smile tugging at her lips. "Okay," she whispered. Mark felt a surge of hope, his chest swelling with love and determination. It wasn't much, just a small word, a small step. But it was a beginning, a fragile, beautiful beginning. The next few weeks were filled with highs and lows. Sophie's trust in him was slowly growing, but it was still delicate, easily shattered by the smallest misstep. She had good days, days when she would laugh and play with him, her smile bright and carefree. But there were also bad days, days when she would retreat into herself, her gaze distant and guarded. Mark tried to be patient. He knew he couldn't rush this, couldn't force her to accept him. He had to prove himself day by day, moment by moment, and slowly, bit by bit, Sophie began to let him in. One rainy afternoon, as they sat together in the cozy living room of Martha's house, Sophie turned to him, her expression serious. "Daddy?" Mark looked up, his heart skipping a beat. "Yes, sweetheart? Will you, will you help me paint something?" The question caught him off guard. Mark blinked, surprise and hope surging through him. "Of course," he said softly. "What would you like to paint?" Sophie bit her lip, her gaze darting to the blank canvas sitting on the table. "Something for Mommy." Mark's chest tightened. He reached out, gently brushing a curl away from her face. "I think she would love that." They spent the next few hours together, dipping brushes into bright, cheerful colors, mixing shades and patterns. Sophie's giggles filled the room as she splattered paint on his arm, and Mark couldn't help but laugh along, his heart light and full. By the time they were finished, the canvas was a riot of color and joy, a beautiful, chaotic masterpiece that seemed to capture Sophie's spirit perfectly. "Do you think Mommy would like it?" Sophie asked softly, her gaze fixed on the painting. Mark swallowed hard, blinking back the tears that stung his eyes. "I think she would love it, sweetheart," he whispered, "just like I do." Sophie looked up at him, her small face glowing with happiness. "Thank you, Daddy." Mark felt his heart swell, the words filling him with a fierce, overwhelming love. He reached out, pulling her into his arms. "No, Sophie," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." From that day on, something shifted between them. Sophie started seeking him out more, her smile brighter, her laughter more frequent. She began calling him Daddy without hesitation, her voice filled with a quiet, fragile trust that made Mark's heart ache with gratitude. But even as their bond grew stronger, Mark knew there were still shadows lurking in the background. The media had quieted down after the initial frenzy, but the curiosity was still there. People still whispered, still speculated, and Sophie, innocent, sweet Sophie, was starting to notice. "Daddy?" she asked one evening as they sat together in the garden, watching the stars. "Why do people keep talking about us?" Mark's heart sank. He looked down at her, his chest tightening. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Sophie fidgeted, her small hands twisting in her lap. "At school, some of the kids said things. They said you're not really my daddy." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Mark felt his breath catch, his mind reeling. "That's not true," he said fiercely. "I am your daddy, Sophie. Don't ever doubt that." "But they said—" Sophie's voice broke, and she looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "They said you're just pretending, that you're going to leave, just like Mommy did." Mark's heart shattered. He reached out, pulling her into his arms, holding her tight. "No," he whispered, his voice fierce and raw. "No, Sophie. I'm never leaving. I'm here. I'm always going to be here." Sophie clung to him, her small body trembling. "Promise?" "I promise," Mark murmured, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I swear, Sophie, I'm your daddy, and nothing is ever going to change that." They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, the weight of the world pressing down on them. But as Mark held his daughter close, He knew one thing for certain. He would fight for her, no matter what. He would fight to keep her, to protect her, to be the father she needed. Because Sophie wasn't just a part of his life. She was his whole world. Mark had thought winning Sophie's trust would be the hardest part of their journey. He had assumed that once they crossed that hurdle, things would fall into place, that he and his daughter would finally be able to live their lives without fear or pain. But as the months passed, he realized that building a relationship was just one battle. The war for Sophie's happiness, her safety, and her future was only beginning. It started with the whispers. The same whispers that had reached Sophie's ears in school spread further, seeping into every corner of their lives. The tabloids feasted on their story, twisting it into a salacious tale of hidden heirs and secret love children. Headlines screamed questions like, "Is Sophie Evans the billionaire's illegitimate child?" And "The dark past of Mark Williams. What else is he hiding?" Mark did everything he could to shield Sophie from the chaos. He tightened security around their home, arranged for private tutoring so she wouldn't have to face the stares and whispers at school, and refused to engage with the media circus. But no matter how hard he tried, the world's scrutiny pressed down on them like a suffocating weight. One morning, as Mark sat at the kitchen table reviewing the newspaper, his fingers clenched around the edges. There, plastered across the front page, was a grainy photo of him and Sophie leaving the gallery. The caption read, "Father and daughter, or just a PR stunt." He gritted his teeth, fury boiling in his chest. How dare they? How dare they question his love for Sophie, insinuate that she was some pawn in a twisted game? He was her father. He had every right to be with her, to protect her, to love her. "Daddy?" The soft, hesitant voice made him look up sharply. Sophie stood in the doorway, her eyes wide and wary. She looked so small, her face pale and drawn, and Mark's heart clenched. "Sweetheart?" he murmured, setting the newspaper aside quickly. "What's wrong?" Sophie bit her lip, glancing at the crumpled pages on the table. "Why are they saying those things about us?" Mark's chest tightened. He opened his arms and Sophie hesitated only for a moment before crossing the room and curling up on his lap. He held her close, pressing his lips to her hair, wishing he could erase every hurtful word, every painful doubt. "Because some people don't understand," he murmured, his voice low and soothing. "They don't know how much I love you. But why do they want to hurt us?" Sophie's voice trembled, and Mark's heart ached. "What did we do wrong?" "Nothing, sweetheart," he whispered fiercely. "You didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes people just like to make trouble where there isn't any." Sophie was silent for a long moment. Then she looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "But it makes me scared, Daddy. What if they make you go away?" Mark felt something break inside him. He wrapped his arms around her tighter, his chest burning with a mix of anger and helplessness. "No one is going to make me go away, Sophie, I promise. But the lady on TV said—" "She said maybe I shouldn't be with you," Sophie whispered, her small body trembling. She said I need a real mommy and daddy." Mark's breath caught, his vision blurred with red-hot rage. Who was spreading these lies? Who dared to suggest that Sophie wasn't safe with him, that he wasn't a fit father? "You listen to me," he said softly, lifting her chin so she met his gaze. "You have a real daddy, and that's me. I love you more than anything in the world, Sophie, and I'm never, ever going to let anyone take you away from me. Do you understand?" Sophie nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "But what if they don't believe you?" "They will," Mark said fiercely. "I'll make them believe. I'll show them that you belong with me." But it was easier said than done. The tabloids continued their relentless assault, each headline more vicious than the last. Rumors swirled, accusations that Mark was unfit to be a parent, that he was using Sophie for publicity, that his sudden interest in her was just a desperate bid for sympathy. It all came to a head one bleak afternoon when Mark received a summons to appear in court. His heart plummeted as he read the letter, the words blurring together. Petition for custody. Claimant, Susan Evans, paternal grandmother of Sophie Evans. Susan Evans, Laura's mother. Sophie's grandmother. Mark stared at the paper, his chest tightening with a mix of fear and fury. He had never met Laura's mother, but Laura had mentioned her in passing. A cold, controlling woman who had disapproved of Laura's choices, who had pushed her daughter away because she hadn't followed the path laid out for her. And now, after all these years, she was back. Back to take Sophie away. No, Mark whispered, his hands shaking. Number she can't. I won't let her. But the legal process had already begun. Susan had filed a petition for custody, claiming that Mark was unfit, that Sophie needed a stable, two-parent household, that she should be raised by her own blood. And with the media storm swirling around them, her case was gaining traction. Martha was furious when she found out. That woman has no right, she spat, pacing back and forth in Mark's living room. She didn't even try to reach out after Laura died. And now she thinks she can just swoop in and take Sophie? Over my dead body. Mark's head throbbed. But what if she wins, he whispered, his voice hollow. What if the court believes her? They might think she's right. Martha stopped pacing, turning to look at him sharply. You listen to me, Mark Williams, she said fiercely. You have been there for Sophie every day since you found out about her. You have fought for her, loved her, protected her. You are her father, and no one can take that away from you. Mark swallowed hard, his chest tight. But what if it's not enough? It will be, Martha said quietly, her gaze softening. Because you're going to show them. You're going to show everyone that you are the father Sophie needs, that you are her family. The court battle was brutal. Susan Evans arrived with a team of high-powered lawyers, armed with evidence that painted Mark as an irresponsible, absentee father, who had only shown up when it was convenient for him. They dredged up every mistake he had ever made, every missed opportunity, every business scandal. They portrayed him as a man who couldn't possibly be trusted to raise a child. Mark sat through it all, his jaw clenched, his fists trembling. But the worst part, the part that nearly broke him, was watching Sophie. She was so small, so fragile, sitting on the witness stand with her big blue eyes wide and frightened. Susan's lawyers fired question after question at her, twisting her words, making her doubt everything she knew. Do you love your grandmother, Sophie? One of them asked, his voice smooth and gentle. Wouldn't you like to live with her? Sophie glanced at Susan, who was watching her with a stern, expectant expression. Then she looked at Mark, her small face pale. I don't know, she whispered, her voice trembling. The lawyer smiled, his gaze sharp. But don't you think it would be nice to have a real family? A mommy and a daddy who can take care of you? Mark's heart stopped. He wanted to jump up, to scream, to stop this farce. But he couldn't move. He could only watch, his heart breaking, as Sophie's gaze flickered uncertainly. I just want my daddy, she whispered finally, her voice so soft it was almost inaudible. The lawyer's smile faded. But your daddy is always busy, isn't he? Wouldn't you like to be with someone who can be there for you all the time? Sophie's small fists clenched. She shook her head, her curls bouncing. My daddy loves me, she said louder this time. He's always there. He promised. Mark felt something shatter inside him. He blinked rapidly, trying to keep the tears at bay. I'm here, Sophie, he thought desperately. I'm right here. Thank you, Sophie, the lawyer said coolly, dismissing her. Sophie slid off the chair, her small shoulders hunched and ran to Mark's side. He scooped her up, holding her tight, his heart aching. You did so good, sweetheart, he whispered, pressing a kiss to her hair. You were so brave. Daddy, she whimpered, her small hands clutching his shirt. Are they going to take me away? No, Mark said fiercely, his arms tightening around her. No, Sophie. I'm going to fight. I'm going to fight for you with everything I have. And he did. Day after day, Mark faced Susan's accusations, her attempts to discredit him, to paint him as a danger to Sophie. But he refused to back down. He refused to let anyone, no matter how powerful or influential, take his daughter away. Finally, after weeks of grueling hearings, the judge handed down the verdict. Custody will remain with Mark Williams. Mark's breath left him in a rush. He looked at Sophie, his vision blurred with tears, and saw her small face light up with pure, unfiltered joy. We won, Daddy, she whispered. Yes, sweetheart, he choked out, pulling her into his arms. We won. They had won. Against all odds, against every obstacle, they had won. And Mark swore that he would spend the rest of his life proving that they belonged together. Mark sat on the floor of his living room, surrounded by a sea of brightly colored art supplies, paintbrushes, glitter, and countless sheets of drawing paper. Sophie's giggles echoed through the room, her face smeared with paint as she looked up at him, her eyes sparkling with joy. It was a far cry from the tense, battle-filled days of the custody trial. Now there was only laughter, creativity, and love. "Daddy, look!" Sophie held up her latest masterpiece, a chaotic swirl of blues, yellows, and reds, dotted with tiny hearts. "It's a picture of us." Mark's heart swelled as he took the paper from her, pretending to examine it with exaggerated seriousness. "This is amazing, sweetheart," he murmured, blinking away the unexpected moisture in his eyes. "I love it. It's perfect." Sophie beamed, scooting closer to him. "You can put it in your office so you always have me with you." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. He reached out, pulling her into his lap and kissing her forehead gently. "I'll put it right next to my desk," he promised softly, "so I can see it every day." It was moments like these, simple, quiet, filled with warmth, that made everything worthwhile. He had fought tooth and nail to keep Sophie, to prove that he could be the father she needed. And now, for the first time in what felt like forever, things were settling into place. Their little family, fractured and fragile, was slowly mending. But the journey was far from over. Sophie's heart, though brimming with love, still bore the scars of loss. There were nights when she woke up crying, calling out for her mother, her small body trembling in his arms. Mark would hold her, whispering softly, telling her stories of Laura, the woman who had been the light of his life and the mother Sophie had lost too soon. "Daddy, do you miss Mommy?" Sophie asked one evening, her voice a soft murmur in the quiet of her bedroom. She lay curled up beside him, her head resting on his chest as he stroked her hair gently. "Every day," Mark whispered, his heart aching. "I miss her every single day." Sophie was silent for a long moment. Then she shifted, looking up at him with wide, thoughtful eyes. Do you think she's watching us?" Mark felt his throat tighten. He forced a smile, cupping her cheek gently. "I think she is, sweetheart, and I think she's very proud of you." Sophie's gaze searched his face, as if looking for reassurance. "And of you too, Daddy?" The question caught him off guard. Mark blinked, his chest tightening. "I hope so," he whispered, his voice rough. "I hope she knows I'm trying." Sophie reached up, her small hand resting on his cheek. "She knows," she said firmly. "I know she does." Mark swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. Sophie had such faith in him, such unshakable belief that he was good, that he was doing his best. It humbled him, it terrified him, and it made him want to be worthy of her love, to be the father she believed him to be. "I love you, Sophie," he murmured, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "More than anything in the world." Sophie snuggled closer, a soft smile curving her lips. "I love you too, Daddy." It wasn't always easy. There were still challenges, still moments of doubt and fear. But every day, they grew stronger, together. Mark threw himself into fatherhood with a single-minded determination, learning everything he could about being the best parent for Sophie. He read books on child psychology, consulted with therapists, and enrolled in parenting workshops. He rearranged his work schedule, making sure he was home for every dinner, every bedtime story, every little moment that mattered. But there were still shadows that lingered. Sophie had started asking more questions about her mother, wanting to know what Laura was like, what she had loved, what had made her laugh. And each question was a bittersweet reminder of the life they could have had, the life Sophie had lost. "Daddy, did Mommy like flowers?" Sophie asked one afternoon as they walked through the garden, her small hand clasped in his. Mark smiled, his heart aching. "She loved them," he murmured. "She used to say that flowers made the world a little bit brighter." Sophie tilted her head thoughtfully, her gaze drifting over the colorful blooms around them. "Did she have a favorite?" "Sunflowers," Mark said softly. "She loved sunflowers. She said they were like little drops of sunshine." Sophie's face lit up, Can we plant some? Mark blinked, surprised. You want to plant sunflowers? Sophie nodded eagerly, her eyes wide and bright. So Mommy can see them, and so we can see her. Mark felt his heart squeeze. He knelt down, looking into her earnest gaze, and nodded slowly. Yes, he whispered. We can plant sunflowers. For your mommy. The next weekend, they spent hours in the garden, kneeling side by side as they dug small holes in the rich soil. Sophie chattered happily as she worked, her small hands gentle as she pressed the seeds into the ground. Mark watched her, his chest tight with a mixture of love and sorrow. He wished Laura could see this, see the beautiful, bright little girl they had created together, see how much she had grown. Do you think they'll grow tall? Sophie asked, glancing up at him. Mark smiled, reaching out to tuck a stray curl behind her ear. I think they'll grow as tall as you want them to, sweetheart. Sophie's face softened, her gaze drifting back to the freshly planted seeds. Good, she murmured, because I want Mommy to see them from heaven. Mark's heart twisted painfully. He reached out, pulling her into his arms and pressing his lips to her hair. She'll see them, Sophie, he whispered. I promise. They tended to the sunflowers every day, watering them carefully, watching as the small green shoots began to peek through the soil. And as the flowers grew, so did their bond. Sophie's laughter became more frequent, her smiles brighter. She began to open up more, sharing her thoughts, her dreams, her memories of Laura. They were a family, and nothing would ever change that. Thank you so much for listening to this heartfelt story. If you felt the emotions of this journey and want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming and inspiring stories. Make sure to leave a comment and share your thoughts. See you in the next story.